Hello and welcome to the Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. I'm Dr. Mark Aldridge. I'm an agathologist, which means that I research and write about Agatha Christie all the time, including my latest book, Agatha Christie's Marple Expert on Wickedness.
Yes, and I'm Gray Robert Brown. I'm a writer and a crispy
duck.
I'm vegan. I'm Gray Robert Brown, and I'm a writer and a Christie celebrant. I celebrate Christie.
You bring
all
us
the
together
time.
like at a wedding ceremony.
Yes,
you bring
we all
the
hold
Christies
hands,
together. We hold hands
and we talk about how great she is, which is
Yeah.
essentially what this podcast has been in a nutshell. And this is our last regular episode.
Right.
Sorry for the listener. Mark said before we started recording.
Could you have broken that to me a little more gently?
Can I just say,
breaking up the band
before we started recording, Mark was like, I'm going to pretend, when you say it's the last regular episode, I'm going to pretend that you haven't told me that, and that's a surprise to me as a bit.
So tell me more. Why are you breaking up the band?
It was always the plan, wasn't it, to kind of set out our
Yes.
stall with these major themes. That's not to say that there aren't more topics.
No, indeed.
This is not the end of the Swinging Christies.
No, that's really important. This isn't the end of the podcast, and it's not the end of our wider project in the world of Agatha Christie. And so we've done these core episodes, and by doing them, we have found little areas that we really want to expand on and have a little bit more of a chat about, and some people perhaps we won't want to speak to ideally. All sorts of things that we still want to talk about.
Yes, I mean, we already have bonus episodes recorded.
We do.
We have many more in the pipeline, and lots just kind of swimming around as TBC as well. So there'll definitely be a Swinging Christies podcast beyond this. It just is going to sort of change shape slightly, I think it's fair to say. And also not just on the podcast feed, but beyond. But all of that's very exciting, very top secret.
Yes. So how are you, Gray, now that you've dropped this big
Well,
atom bomb on me?
Well, how are you? Are you a little shaken?
Well,
now that
I just
rejected you.
Yes. I'm just thinking, now what do I do? I've got like, this is my life.
You'll be twiddling your thumbs now, won't you? Because
Yes.
famously you're not
I'm
very busy at all.
nothing to do. Do you know, my publisher said to me when he was listening to, hi David, if you're listening.
Hi, David.
He said, you like to make work for yourself, don't you?
Yeah,
And I said,
we
I
really
know,
do.
I really do.
It's true. How are you?
Devastated. Wondering what I'm going to do now.
Okay, good. Nice to hear it. So, this episode... Moving swiftly on, this episode, curtain up on fame.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
Mark Aldridge, Dr. Mark Aldridge. Don't tut into the mic. It's very sensitive equipment. You've said before...
I'm very sensitive.
We're demob happy because this is the last regular episode. You've said before that the 1960s was arguably Christie's most successful decade. Now, I'm quoting, "The 1960s saw ever-increasing interest in Christie, not only as a person and writer of popular mysteries, but also as a respected author whose works required dissection and intelligent consideration. Requests for interviews continued to be made, and occasionally Christie consented to them, especially when it came to the respectable broadsheet newspapers and illustrious international publications. She was asked if she would be interviewed for a Japanese newspaper which was seeking conversations with notable persons including, this is the company she's keeping, Fidel Castro, Robert Kennedy, Benjamin Britten, Salvador Dali, Noel Coward, Somerset Maugham, Arthur Miller, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Luther King. For once, I am not averse, Christie responded. Japan prints my books beautifully. Do you recognise that quote,
So
Mark Aldridge? It is quoting from Mark's
It's from
upcoming Marple book, which you can pre-order now. It's like the ultimate form of mansplaining, isn't it? To sit you down and to read your own book to you. But beautifully put, I thought.
Oh, thank you. This era really has got Agatha Christie just being respected a little bit more. Not that, I think there's a popular perception that she was always poorly received by critics, like because she was so popular. But actually, generally, reviews were really good, including in the broadsheets.
And even for some of these latter novels that are maybe not as well thought of now, which is partly why we're doing this, to kind of salvage the reputation of some of these later novels. But you were saying that many of the instant responses were more positive.
Absolutely. And Passenger to Frankfurt...
Passenger to Frankfurt is a standalone espionage thriller about Sir Stafford Nye's hunt for answers from 1970.
Got actually really quite good reviews. There were some real stinkers, don't get me wrong, but generally it was quite well received. And I think that is quite different to now, that all these decades on, that Agatha Christie has been perhaps memorialised in a way that really emphasises the whodunit nature of her writings. Those are the ones that, you make films of. That is what she's really well known for. So I think perhaps a casual reader, a general reader's reaction to taking an Agatha Christie off the shelf and finding it isn't a whodunit might be rather different to when you're in the midst of her each year releasing books that perhaps are more varied. So there were some reviewers who really focused on Christie's whodunits and puzzle mysteries as being notably for them superior to the other stuff. Julian Simmons, for example, who is also a crime fiction writer, said in his review of A Caribbean Mystery that if his choice of top crime fiction book falls on Miss Agatha Christie, it is because this serpent of old Nile shows almost her old deceiving skills in A Caribbean Mystery. So this idea that she was nearly there, that she perhaps wasn't quite at her peak, but that because she was constructing, publishing, writing a story that still had that sort of old puzzle mystery magic. That's something that really appealed, I think, to Simmons.
Yeah, I think this idea is another dimension to the criticism that was around in the 60s whilst Christie was writing that's interesting, which is not just taking her on her own terms as you would, say, a new novelist, but always defining a new book by whether or not it's up to the standard of her golden age.
Yes.
Which is still very much the way that we as diehard Christie fans talk about the later books, and something that I think one of the aims of this project was to challenge slightly, because maybe it's not actually the most interesting or constructive or helpful thing to say, is A Caribbean Mystery as good as Death on the Nile? And maybe A Caribbean Mystery can just be its own thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and especially because I think in those early decades of general Agatha Christie criticism, so like the 60s and 70s, the people who were writing about her, people like Simmons and Keating and a little bit later Charles Osborne, they were people who were really interested in crime fiction, in whodunits, in the puzzle mysteries. So it makes sense that when they're summarising her career, those are the ones that are held up as the biggest and most important ones. And that becomes a bit of received wisdom, I think.
Yes.
That when you go back, you're reading, getting a sense of what the whole of Agatha Christie's output is like, that if you've got someone whose passion is puzzle mysteries and they're writing about Agatha Christie, then of course that whole emphasis is going to be on those. And I would say, by the way, that I do think her puzzle mysteries are the best, but that doesn't mean that they're the only ones that are worth discussing and that there isn't great merit in loads of her other stuff as well.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily saying I disagree with that. I'm also not saying I agree with that. I think it's sort of not the most constructive or interesting conversation to have is to say, like puzzle mystery versus thriller, like which one comes up on top, because they're doing very different things. And actually, to be fair, I think a lot of her looser puzzle mysteries just get sort of sideswiped into the thriller category rather than, again, being kind of met on their own terms, really. We sort of kicked off this point, I guess, towards the end of the Armageddon episode, but there is this strange idea that a thriller, which originates from Christie's own self-consciousness in her autobiography, that a thriller is somehow easy to write and I think, and less of an achievement than a whodunit. And I just don't personally think that's true. And I think many thriller writers would have something to say about that. So. There's another quote that you pull out in your excellent Marple book, pre-order now, the Times Literary Supplement, isn't it, that praises but then immediately pulls it back. It's like Agatha Christie deserves her fame, they write, but then her writing is abominably careless, her formula hopelessly out of date. This caveating that goes on, and this genre snobbery again, we talked about this at the start of this project, and it's still very much a preoccupation of ours. This snobbery of Christie, I'd like to say that it's kind of a new phenomena that we come up against sometimes, where people just think she's formulaic and it's just genre. But sadly, that did exist in some of the contemporary reactions to her work as well.
Yeah, and I think that there is a sense that not just genre, but also period. I think that people are often applying different expectations to different eras of her writing. And there is a general sense, I think, that the 1920s and 30s are sort of her peak, or moving towards her peak in the 30s in particular. And it's really interesting. We were having this brief little chat because I was thinking about it, and especially Dorothy L. Sayers, obviously another queen of crime, who stops writing the Second World War, basically, or stops writing crime fiction, to say, at the Second World War, and goes on to do other stuff. And I was like, I wonder what Christie's legacy would be like if we'd actually just stopped there, because it's all very well saying loads of her most famous and perhaps best stuff is from the 20s and 30s, but actually I think her legacy really depends on the fact that she continues to write really strong stuff and sustains it and keeps moving. You know, she writes contemporary fiction, what we said way back in episode 1. She is writing about how society is changing through these world wars, through all the sort of changes in society and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't be without, you know, The Pale Horse and Endless Night and Ordeal by Innocence and Crooked House and all of those amazing books that come post 1945. Yeah,
and I think I say it in Marple or maybe in Poirot. I say it in Poirot. that I think that the books from the 1960s are no more mixed in quality than certainly the 1920s. You know, the era of, you know, Styles, although she wrote that a little bit before, Murder Roger Ackroyd. I really think that if I had to sit and read all of her novels from the 20s or all of her novels from the 60s, for me, I think the 60s edges them out a little bit, because...
Well, that's why we didn't do the Roaring 20s podcast.
Yes. but
next time.
Yeah, I just feel that she's always got something more to say in the 60s. Yeah. I think in the 20s, you can feel, like she says in her autobiography, her slightly taking her foot off the pedal with some of those thrillers. Just sort of, don't you think?
I disagree with that. But I do agree with the overall point. And it's funny because I think I'd read that in Poirot not long before you first came to me with this whole project idea. And we're kind of looping right back to the start, where that was very much like an instigating statement for you, as this decade should be thought of as at least as well as, say, the 20s is. And like I've said this before, I'll say it again, I don't think there's a bad book in the 60s. I personally wouldn't have been able to go into this podcast with such enthusiasm and passion if I thought there was a duff in there. I genuinely don't think there is a duff.
And in terms of sales, she's still doing really well. I mean, I think she's still doing really well. She's doing better than ever. So in an interview with Julian Simmons early in the 1960s, he asked her, how do your books sell, basically? And she says that they sell better than ever.
She says, none of your business.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really. And says that she was shown, you know, she gets a graph of sales that keeps going up. And indeed, they did. There are letters in the HarperCollins archive and stuff where each year around Christmas time, they would send her and say, amazingly, your book has sold better than last year's did. And going back to that question of genre, it didn't really matter whether it was a Poirot book, a Miss Marple book, a thriller or what. They just kept going up. So it was the name. It was her as a writer, not necessarily her as a genre writer, that was really appealing to people.
And she says at the point, even the last book, and she must mean Christmas Pudding at this point, the collection of short stories, which I didn't think would sell so well, apparently sold better than the ones before. So yeah, that proves your point completely. And there's an essay by Elizabeth Walter in the HRF Keating collection where she explicitly states that Passenger to Frankfurt, so the final book in our swinging canon, quote, beat all records, for by the end of the first year, there were 58,000 copies in print. And it bears repeating, she's international. Again, quoting Keating, a conversation with him titled The Mistress of Simplicity by Edmund Crispin. It says, her simplicity helps her books to translate well, as does her lack of interest in police procedure, which naturally differs from country to country. Although I can't imagine this was Christie's game plan from the off, the fact that Poirot is retired mostly, and Marple and Tommy and Tuppence are amateurs, and a lot of her one-off sleuths are, you know, sort of outsiders to some degree as well. actually helps her maybe arguably in this world dominance. She is Mrs. Worldwide.
She really is, and still is, and she's still used on lots of English as a foreign language courses. She's still used in lots of schools internationally, which is fantastic. And I know that's something that, you know, the Agatha Christie brand have been very happy with, the fact that she is so often a gateway to people to learn English and into literature generally, English literature.
Yeah. We always say nowadays she is the biggest selling author the world over. And it definitely feels like that supreme prominence is kicking off in the 1960s.
Yeah, I think so. I think that she's really cementing that position.
Yes, yeah.
One aspect that we haven't touched on is the theatre. And you must remember that she was an avid theatre goer. She went to the theatre when she was in London twice or three times a week. You know, she went to all the Shakespeare Theatre, all the National Theatre, you know, all that sort of thing. And when you come to think of it, as so very few people do that, if you actually do that religiously, you do get quite a grip on, you know, what the liberal establishment is doing at any given time. And I never got any expression of disagreement from her in what that was doing. And she was a huge admirer of the British theatre. And I think one of the things she would be very upset about these days is that, you know, I'm getting quite old now. I can't remember when we had a government that was genuinely in favour of the arts and the theatre in particular, and didn't sort of regard it rather suspiciously as a sort of stick to beat the establishment, which I don't think it is, you know, primarily. I mean, it may, you know, get in a few blows here and there almost by mistake, but it's not. It's just an expression of one part of society's views. And I think that's what she thought.
Wow. So that was Mathew Prichard in conversation with Dr. Mark Aldridge. We heard from Mathew at the start of the project. We're hearing from him again now, talking about Agatha in Theatreland. And yeah, it's fascinating that particularly that notion that, well, of course, Christie was in touch with the modern world because the theatre was almost hell-bent on presenting the modern world back to itself, and that's where Christie spent a great deal of her time. Yeah,
it's something she had a real passion for. We know from, you know, her own writings, autobiography, all sorts of things, that writing plays was a thing that she really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, I like that, and it's a reciprocal relationship. It's not just that she likes writing plays and continues to write plays in the decade that we're talking about, but she also enjoys going to see them as well.
Yes.
It's a two-way street, which is nice to hear, actually.
Especially when you think how varied in the 60s, particularly, you know, there's all sorts of boundary pushing that is visible on stage in London's West End and beyond in the 1960s. So the idea that she was such a regular theatre going that she was pretty much seeing everything.
And in terms of Christie, the theatre in the 1960s, I guess most significantly is the 10-year anniversary of The Mousetrap.
Which seems like such a paltry number now. Isn't it ridiculous? 10 years. Barely worth celebrating 10 years,
I'm fairly sure we've been doing this podcast for 10 years.
So we're obviously, you know, well into the 8th decade now of The Mousetrap. But yes, 10 years, absolutely phenomenal, the idea. Especially a straight play, you know, not a musical. So yeah, there were celebrations for The Mousetrap in 1962 where Christie, who famously hated public speaking, hated having to do anything where she was having to be too social with too many people who she didn't know. Yeah. Although apparently in private was much, much livelier and very, very different. But she would never give a speech except the 10-year anniversary.
Really?
Do you want to hear it?
Yeah. Oh my God, yes.
Okay.
This is awful. I never have been any good making speeches. And usually someone has come to the rescue and has made my speech for me. But nobody's going to help me tonight. So I've got to do it myself. Anyway, the first thing is the great thanks and the really heartfelt gratitude I feel for this great party tonight and the goodness of everybody. And terrible excitement of having a play that's run 10 years, longer than any other play. And sometimes I really can't believe it's me. Because, it's not at all the sort of thing that would happen to me, I should say. If I was writing a book, it wouldn't be a person like me who would have written a play that runs for 10 years. So don't let anybody say that nothing exciting happens to you when you are old, because it does. It's just as nice to be 72 as it is to be young. In fact, tonight it couldn't be more exciting. And the only other thing I have to say is that I do feel an enormous debt of gratitude to all the cast, the actors and actors who've played in the Mousetrap and have made it the success that has made it run 10 years. They've all been good casts and they've all brought something to it special of their own. And another thing is, it's been wonderful to have known so many actors and actresses and to find what a charming lot of people they are and how warm-hearted and kindly and good friends, and some of the people who really don't make me feel shy, as so many people do. But with them I can always feel very happy and at home and friendly. I want to thank my old friend Dickie Attenborough very much indeed for his speech and the kind things he said. He was the first Sergeant Trotter in the Mousetrap, and he started it on its way, and he's been one of my best friends ever since. He and his wife Sheila Sim, who's also here tonight. I can't thank Dame Sybil enough for all the wonderful things she said. So extraordinarily kind and full of feeling and appreciation of what one feels. Anyway, I have one ambition in life. By force or by guile, I shall take Dame Sybil to the Mousetrap. And last of all, I come to Peter Saunders, who put on the Mousetrap and so many of my plays, and has been such a good friend and such fun always. And I'm glad to end I can't call it a speech because it isn't one really, but to end this by saying that I want to thank him first for that most exciting thing that I should never have dreamt of having. Gold on the inside and full of mystery on the inside. It's a wonderful thing to have, and a wonderful thing for him to have thought of. And I now have to say that the next item in the programme will be a little presentation to him. I hope you will like.
Wow.
Oh, isn't that lovely?
She does, you can tell she's nervous, but it's a brilliant speech.
It is. I love that she says, first of all, that she didn't, I'm exactly the sort of person this wouldn't normally happen to, which is so sweet.
Yeah.
But also that she says, don't let anybody say that nothing exciting happens to you when you're old. It's just as nice to be 72 as it is to be young. In fact, tonight it couldn't be more exciting. How important is that to our Swinging Christies perspective, though? She isn't saying, oh, I'm 72, I'm the old guards, ignore me, you all have lots of fun.
Yeah.
She's saying, hey, I don't feel any different, even though I'm 72.
Yeah.
And we know that she's still got so much left to offer.
So much
she's
still to say.
More, yeah.
Our good friend John Curran, in his book, Agatha Christie's Murder in the Making, so that's the second of his two kind of notebooks, explorations, isn't it? He uncovers in the notebook that there is outlined in the likely, he dates it to around the late 60s. She is toying with an idea that she cheekily calls Mousetrap 2. And what I love about this is John sort of outlines what she seems to be noting down and says it has basically nothing in common with that famous play. Perhaps it was so called in the hope of another stage success that might rival this record-breaking title, which again, it's still ambitious, still like looking to follow it up. And yeah, he says strength is also lent to this argument by the fact that by then the Mousetrap was a record breaker.
Yeah. She does talk all the way into the 1970s about still going to see it every now and again.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yes. Because she says in one, I'm due a new visit, actually.
God, I wonder if they told the cast. Because can you imagine being like, Agatha Christie's in tonight?
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Yes. I hope I don't trip over the chaise longue. You know, like...
But I think it's really sweet, that idea that she's thinking, how could I break a record?
Yeah.
Again?
Oh my God, they're like extra snow. Agatha's coming in, extra snow.
But I was speaking to someone not very long ago about, and they were saying, do you think anyone will ever break the Mousetrap record? And I said, literally not in my lifetime. Like, it's literally impossible to, in my lifetime, for a play to break the record.
When are you planning on dying?
Well, because it's been running, let's assume if it closes in its 80th year, and if I were to live for another 50 years.
Why would you say such a thing?
Has anything been running for 30 years?
Drink up, Mark.
But that's just how long it is. It's like multi-generation.
Yeah.
You would to break the Mousetrap's record, you would have to straddle multiple generations.
It's true. Is that bitter almonds I smell?
Not again. You'll get me this time.
And we should say that the kind of fullest published exploration of Christie, first and foremost as a theatre writer, is of course Julius Green's book, Agatha Christie, A Life in Theatre, his central argument being that Christie is the most successful playwright of all time, but we don't couch her in those terms necessarily. But even Agatha Christie, the novelist, thinks often in theatrical terms whilst writing her novels, doesn't she?
Yeah, it pops up a lot that people talk about the theatre actually quite a lot in her books. And they go to the theatre. But we get in The Pale Horse.
The Pale Horse is a standalone novel that explores mysterious goings-on and unexplained deaths at a countryside inn from 1961.
Characters going to see Shakespeare at the Old Vic. And then afterwards, Mark Easterbrook, they've all gone for food and drinks, says how Shakespeare might get a few surprises if he saw his plays acted nowadays. And Hermia, his girlfriend at the time, says the eternal surprise of the author at what the producer has done to him, which might be a little hint of Christie's perspective.
I was going to say, we're very good at not equating characters' opinions to Christie on this podcast, but maybe in that instance we'll let that be equated. Yeah, it's definitely a little sideswipe, isn't it? But that's interesting because slightly edgy, slightly modern version of Macbeth is exactly the sort of thing that the Old Vic would do now.
Yeah.
In Passenger to Frankfurt, Stafford specifically highlights that events around him feel like it's almost like he's in a play. He says, the curtain raiser would remain a curtain raiser, a silly little play that received latecomers to the theatre and diverted them until the real business of the evening began. And later says it's a gigantic show, meaning this global conspiracy, a show put on by a producer, a complete group of producers perhaps. That monstrous woman pays the producer, hires the producer. We've not seen the producer. What we've seen today is the star performer, meaning this kind of neo-Nazi figure. And then there are these machinations, these people behind the scenes pulling the strings. And it does read like there is this great arena. There is this, theatricality to it and this world stage on which the plot is taking place. So, yeah, even when writing prose, Christie is never far away from one of her true loves, aka treading the boards.
And she's writing original plays for theatre, such as Rule of Three, but we haven't really spoken about Go Back for Murder very much. Go Back for Murder is a play adaptation of the mystery novel Five Little Pigs that opened in 1960. So you're taking a novel from 20 years earlier, stripping Poirot out of it, and then retelling it for an early 60s theatre audience who we've just said may well be expecting stuff that is modern, that is trying out perhaps a few more new things.
Well, Julius makes the point that it's natural that Five Little Pigs would be chosen as, by this point, Christie's novels are increasingly becoming, we might retrospectively think of as inspired by Five Little Pigs, i.e. so many of her later books are about remembered deaths and uncovering past crimes in a way that one of the things that characterises many of her earlier books is that they're very immediate. It's about the crime that's just happened. So with that in mind, it does make sense for where Christie's at in the 60s. But Julius does also point out that it's, and I'm quoting now, perverse that she had specifically chosen one of the very titles that she'd highlighted to Edmund Cork, her agent, in a letter in 52, I think, as being like, that one would be tricky to adapt. And then she sets herself the challenge of doing it.
That is textbook Agatha Christie.
Textbook Agatha Christie.
That would be really tough. I'll give it a go.
Good for her. Yeah, absolutely.
I noticed when I was reading it early on for this project, because I always pay attention to when it's supposed to be set, because I find that really interesting with Agatha Christie stuff. Like, when does it become period?
Yes.
With her plays in particular.
Well, with the plays in particular, because as we keep saying, as you've said this episode already, the novels do keep up with contemporary times, but the plays not necessarily.
No, but for this, Go Back for Murder, it says time, the present, autumn. So it's a book from the early 1940s, now a play, but the play is absolutely set at the beginning of the 1960s. So there is already a bit of a difference there. And one of the reasons why I always look, I think I can now explain why we are at Christie_time, why we're always
a world exclusive,
time.
Mark.
World exclusive. So this is what, again, one of the really early things that we discussed is that, so in the play script for A Murder is Announced, which was adapted by Leslie Darbon, so it wasn't written by Christie, and it was staged in 1977, so just after her death. But at the beginning, when they're establishing the scene, for all the players and the director to know, it says that it's set in Christie time. And that got my hackles up right away. And that's what I remember speaking to you and saying, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And for me, that sums up one of the problems with that play, which is that it's so entrenched in the post-war period, that novel. It's so important that it's 5 years after the war has ended. Still got rationing, but society's trying to get back to normal, but there's still a huge shadow of this war. And that is completely stripped out. And we're told that it's in Christie time, which absolutely says, I don't really know when this is. Agatha Christie didn't really write about the real world. It's her own little bubble.
Yeah.
And that's such nonsense.
It shows
I'm getting annoyed just saying it now.
that
I was just like,
crimson.
We are Christie time to say there's no such thing.
It shows an ignorance of what Christie's really doing, for sure. And also, it is that common misconception that she is writing about an England that never quite existed, and that she is inherently just in a negative way nostalgia and nothing more sophisticated than that. And yes, if we've done one thing over the last 9 episodes, it's to rebuke that wholeheartedly, I hope. So in the essay in Keating titled Midas' Gift to the Theatre, it reads, it was fitting, I think, that her final one actor, The Patient.
The Patient is a one-act play, part of the Rule of Three, which are 3 collected plays, about a hospitalised woman who may be able to expose the truth about her accident, from 1962.
Depended on its curtain line. So it was a really nice little point that I picked out. It's not, admittedly, the final play that Christie writes, but as a way to bring the curtain down on Christie's amazing theatrical legacy.
For her to literally say, I've told you all I know. I've given you everything you need.
Exactly.
Come on. It's been 40 plus years.
It's over to you now.
Yeah, you could work this out. You know all my tricks.
But even the way that the play really does end, even that, you can come out behind the curtain and then the curtain falls on Christie's incredible legacy. I mean, it is really actually quite potent.
And she does do more in the 60s that we haven't spoken about, but we'll circle back to in a bonus episode. She writes a play called Miss Perry, which is not produced, but a script survives. If only there were a way that we could still talk about it. Let's wait and see. Let's wait and see.
Oh, you're such a tease. Yeah, and the last thing I just wanted to put out before we move on from theatre was, and we did mention this before in, I believe, our first episode, in our sex episode, but this is a period in which, until towards the end of the decade, there is still very active censorship controls on British theatre. We saw in that episode the recommendations for language changes in various Christie plays, and that was a requirement that you would send the script to the Lord Chamberlain's office and it would be thoroughly vetted and checked. And actually, there's just a period detail in Murder Most Foul. Murder Most Foul is a loose film adaptation of Mrs. McGinty's Dead with Margaret Rutherford's Miss Marple from 1963. Mr. Stringer at one point does go off to the censorship office, and that's very much the lived experience for theatrical types in the 60s until it's lifted in 1968.
So did Agatha Christie watch television?
She knew everything about anything that she thought contributed to society, in particular young society, She knew everything about it, and she lived in Wallingford, as you know. And her cook, Mrs. Belson, was the only person in the house with a television. And if there was something she wanted to watch on the television, she used to tiptoe through the dining room and through the kitchen. Mrs. Belson, would you mind if I watched whatever it is? And so she kept up to date. I mean, but she picked and chose what she... But we were all like that a bit in those days, weren't we? I mean, we didn't have sort of BBC iPlayer and all the things which now enable us to watch far more television. But I'm not a great television watcher. I watch sport and what Lucy and I think are the best of modern drama and all that kind of thing. But and I suspect Nima was not very different.
It's ironic, isn't it, that Christie is such a mainstay of modern TV and yet not the most avid watcher, although the story about sneaking down and peeking it is great.
It's such a great image, isn't it? Of course, I'm not interested in television, but there is something good on tonight.
Yeah,
I might not, because there are a few things that she mentions in her letter. She talks about like seeing a documentary. She talks about seeing the moon landings. So there are things that she saw, but wasn't an avid viewer like many of us were or have been over the years.
Yeah.
As her fame grew, of course, people from television and film, which were of course looking to capitalise on Christie's success.
Yeah.
So that there were discussions. I know that Rosalind, so Christie's daughter, she wrote a letter about how much she'd enjoyed May Gray, which was a BBC a series from the early 60s for the most part, and said, if we could get something like May Gray, that would work. And she wrote that in the mid 60s. By the end of the 70s, so Christie has died by this point, and Rosalind says at one point in a letter, it's starting to look a bit odd that Agatha Christie's not on television, actually, and that maybe we should really think about the best way to do that. And that's how we get to things like Why Didn't They Ask Evans, the first version, and Partners in Crime, the Tommy and Tuppence stuff, Agatha Christie Hour, and then eventually to Miss Marple a few years later with Joan Hicks.
Brilliant, yeah. And I'm going to embarrass you by saying I think that story is beautifully told at the start of your Agatha Christie on Screen book. I remember reading that now, that you sort of track how the Christie adaptation industry comes from its sort of stumbling beginnings into the point where they do have a presence on TV to rival something like May Gray's.
So even though Christie's not an avid watcher of television by any means, she knows it's important. She knows it's a big part of society and what people are doing. So it does get a few mentions, not always positive, but certainly is there. So in By the Pricking of My Thumbs.
By the Pricking of My Thumbs sees Tommy and Tuppence return to investigate a mystery at a nursing home from 1968.
Miss Packard, who works at the sort of care home where Tommy's aunt is staying, talks about a murdered child or something that's happened to a child. And her theory is that it's the TV as often as not that gives them the ideas, which is so common. I mean, I'm a smidge older than you, Gray, and I think that
only a smidge?
Just a smidge. And when I grew up, TV was the big enemy. And I don't know by the time it was you, it's things like iPads and phones and stuff like that. There's always an enemy, screen-based
Bless you for thinking I'm young enough that iPads would be the enemy when I was... No, but it's playing into the themes of the reactionary movement that's in the 60s, of the sort of Mary Whitehouse clean-up TV movement, which is saying, that TV is streaming violence and nastiness directly into your homes and vulnerable people, which I guess Whitehouse is mainly talking about children, but in this instance we're talking about elderly people that are maybe not fully compos mentis, are easily influenced by the things that they see. So that is a very contemporary fear, although like you say, one that hasn't gone away. It's just the media fear today is social media, I suppose.
There are other hints of anti-TV sentiment for some characters. So The Mirror Cracked. The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side is a Miss Marple novel about a poisoning at a film star's house. It's from 1962. The Development, capital T, capital D. We have mention of the row of TV masts, so we know this is modern, right? We know that this is what people are doing in this development. But the vicar, when he comes to Marina Gregg's fate, he says, very nice of you to ask me. I'm afraid, I haven't got a television set myself. But of course, my young people keep me up to the mark. But Marina's a film star, so she might be like, hey, I'm not TV. Actually, it's the cinema that you'll be finding me.
Because it's only really in the last sort of 20 years that TV's become as prestigious, if not a little bit more than being a movie star. But back then it was there was a strata, right?
Very, very strict. Yes. Film stars do not go into TV.
Yeah, so you can imagine Marina being scandalised. I'm also enjoying imagining Agatha's cook reading her latest novel, where she's being like a bit sniffy about TV and thinking, well, you weren't saying that the other night when you crept down to catch a bit of Crossroads, to catch a bit of Nolly.
Yeah, can't miss out on Amy Turtle.
That's a deep cut.
Hey, I know our audience.
Did you catch that thigh slap on Mike? He was so happy with his joke that he slapped his own thigh. Wow, we really are D-Mob happy, aren't we?
Oh my goodness. So, big screen wise,
yes,
Christie's still not a huge fan, but does go to the cinema. We know she goes to see several things.
Yep.
And doesn't seem to have quite so much of a problem with it. But in the little bio that she penned for the back of some of the Penguin editions, she talks about things that she likes and she doesn't like. And she doesn't like the talkies, she says. And she says she finds them difficult to follow, which is quite interesting. But yeah, so not a huge fan of.
She's nodding off in the back row and then going, I didn't understand that plot at all. Which, to be fair, I was going to say I did that.
Textbook Greg.
That is textbook me. Specifically, we know that some months before the publication of The Mirror Cracked, in which Marina, of course, appears, Christie visited the movie studio where Murder at the Gallup was being filmed at the time. And you can definitely see that in the content of Mirror Cracked. Although it did make me think, is Christie thinking of anyone in particular when she creates Marina Gregg, do you think? Is there any kind of modern... Because she certainly wasn't thinking of Margaret Rutherford, to whom The Mirror Cracked is dedicated.
No, definitely not Margaret Rutherford. I don't think anyone in particular. I think it's quite telling about the emphasis in The Mirror Cracked about those like fan magazines or the ones that are about stars. And I suspect that she did a lot of her research through that she was thinking, a little bit of that act, a little bit of Marilyn Monroe, a little bit of that person, and you sort of put them together. I mean, maybe a bit of Elizabeth Taylor, we might even say.
Yeah,
actually, but older. She's like at peak this time.
That's true, yeah. Taylor and Burton, because there is that sense with Jason Rudd, who's Marina's husband in the fiction, and he's the producer and she's the star. There is a sort of Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe, or Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's slight dynamic between the two of them.
Because this is a slightly faded glamour, isn't it, of Marina Gregg? She's a huge name in St Mary Mead, and everyone knows who she is, but she's clearly not, at the peak of her career anymore. We know that she's had years away from acting in particular. And we're told through, Christie's narration that her heyday had been before the rise to supreme importance of vital statistics. She could not have been described as sex incarnate or the bust or the torso. She had been long and slim and willowy. The bones of her face and head had some of the beauty associated with those of Garbo. She had brought personality to her pictures rather more than sex. So I guess that's the answer to your question, actually.
Yeah.
Christie tells us, actually, she's not really Marilyn Monroe, although instinctive idea of who a Hollywood icon is around this time, but that she's actually a bit less sexy, that she's someone who's a little bit more old-fashioned in the type of star that she was.
And actually, I guess Christie is proving her point. Doesn't she say she famously refuses to be drawn on basing people on...
Yes, she does. Yes. So she's not keen on saying, oh, it's just this person.
Yeah. Because I think it feels like there's a lack of artistry there, is to just say they're a direct carbon copy of said person. And it seems that's borne out by the fact that Marina Gregg seems to be a conflation of people and themes.
Yeah, I mean, what she loved, and she speaks about a couple of times, is the idea of seeing someone maybe across a restaurant or something, and hearing enough of their conversations that she can then fill in the gaps and imagine what this person's life is like. That's the way she did it. She didn't so much do, I'm going to put, my friend Alan into this story. Yeah. And so we hear from Heather Badcock, who is
essentially her number one fan.
That happens to live in the development and gets to meet Marina. Not a great day for Heather, I think it's fair to say, but nevertheless, she gets to meet Marina.
Why is it not a great day for Heather, Mark?
Oh, well, if someone offers you a cocktail and it smells...
like bitter almonds. No, Carmo doesn't. Carmo doesn't smell like bitter almonds, does it? But yes, but also she's met her before, of course.
She has met her before, and she's been a long time
reuniting
because she's been ill for a while, that we're told. And I think what's so interesting is that Heather actually respects her as an actress, not so much as just the icon, but saying she's not so young anymore, but she'll always be a wonderful actress. So the idea that Marina isn't a one-dimensional sex icon, that she's someone who actually has got real talent and skill for her acting. I think that's quite sweet, and it's quite an interesting way to look at her fame.
Yeah. Do you know, I think we've said about this on the podcast before, but we went and saw the touring Mirror Cracked From Side to Side production with Susie Blake as Miss Marple, which was really interesting. And I then reread the book for the project shortly after that. And a slight disappointment that I had with the book, even though I do still think it's probably my favourite of the decade, I do still love it, so I'm caveating this. But a tiny, tiny disappointment is I do feel like Marina Gregg disappears off the page for the middle section of the book. She's not actually in it as much as you remember, and she's such a fantastic character. I mean, these quotes bear this out. Yeah. She is so fascinating, so multidimensional, really well sketched. But actually, between Heather's death and then when she's finally interviewed, which I think from memory is quite a while later, you don't see her at all, and you hear instead from the other people in the house, like Jason and Haley,
and I don't think that she and Miss Marple ever meet.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure that they don't meet, and I know certainly in the adaptations, because it always strikes me that in the film with Angela Lansbury and Elizabeth Taylor, who'd worked together in National Velvet many years earlier, and were both big icons of the screen and certainly the stage, particularly for Lansbury. They don't have dialogue together. There is one scene where they are both sort of in the same vicinity, like the outside of the Fate, and then Miss Marple sprains her ankle and has to go home. So it's such a shame. It feels like there's a real missed opportunity there. But then also perhaps Miss Marple might work it out a bit too quickly if she gets to meet too many people.
That's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Time.
She's too good. This is a bit of an aside, but while we're on sort of slightly starry topics, you know, we were talking with James, your partner, yesterday about Radio 3, and it reminded me that the best thing I've ever heard on Radio 3 is an adaptation of the Arthur Miller play Death of a Salesman, starring David Suchet and Zoe Wanamaker. Did you ever catch that?
No.
I must look if it's still on Sounds, or it must be somewhere. Maybe on Audible, actually. But it's fascinating because it was made in, I want to say 2015. It was after they'd worked together many times as Poirot and Ariadne Oliver, and they have and I believe they'd worked together before even Cards on the Table. But they have such an amazing chemistry I guess they're very much sort of the same type of actor and the same generation of actor and all the rest of it. But their chemistry is this husband and wife duo, and they're both doing American accents, but they're both very good American accents, I must say. And you can really feel, I would recommend it heartily for Christie fans and any Swinging Christie fans, because obviously Arthur Miller is very much of the period that we're talking about. The preoccupations that play has are very, very swinging in many ways. But yeah, you can sort of close your eyes and squint your ears, if that's such a thing, and imagine that this is the chemistry between Poirot and Ariadne. They're really beautiful performances with that context in mind, I think.
I think it's interesting that there is a version of the Mirror Cracked that Christie could have written that really embraced this glamour even more. The idea of that it could be really sort of, loads of exciting, parties and all sorts going on. But actually, she really mentions the fact that it's not actually always that exciting to be an actor,
reality.
To work on it. Yeah. Dr. Gilchrist says to Chief Inspector Craddock about how the motion picture life is a life of continuous strain, and the more successful you are, the greater the strain. You live always, all day in the public eye. When you're on location, when you're working, it's hard, monotonous work with long hours. You're there in the morning, you sit and wait, you do your small bit, the bit that's being shot over and over again. When you're shooting a picture, everything's taken out of sequence. You live in luxury, of course. You have soothing drugs, you have baths and creams and powders and medical attention. You have relaxations and parties and people, but you're always in the public eye. I mean, anyone who's ever been on a film or TV set knows how absolutely achingly boring it is. It's the sit around and wait thing of, it's...
Whilst you're getting your foundation done again.
Yeah.
You're right. She could have also written it as a kind of takedown, and it's interesting that stuff like that is very sympathetic to what people go through, given that this is written at the time when she's starting to have doubts about the MGM deal, given that this is written with the context in mind that she wasn't biggest TV watcher or even necessarily the biggest cinema, ultimately more of a bookish and theatre kind of person. It could have been a bit more snooty and scathing than it reads. Ellie, Marina's secretary, says at one point, Marina doesn't come very much in contact with reality. Film stars can lead a fairly insulated life, you know. In fact, very often one has to take care that they do. Things upset them. Things upset her, which is beautifully teeing up, you know, where the plot goes. But yeah, again, a sympathy and a close observation of the realities, which maybe that's what helps Marina feel like a really dominant presence in the book and a really fascinating character from Christie without actually that much page time. I don't know. As we said with Heather, there is this sense of the ordinary and the extraordinary colliding that makes, for me, Mirror Cracked one of the most staggering achievements of the 60s for Christie. And we get that. We think, you know, we have things like, so Hellingforth Studios, which are the film studios, they're just on the other side of St Mary Mead.
Just outside.
Just over the hill, you know.
Past the development.
Yes, yeah, turn right, I think, after the development. But yeah, it's just out of reach, but it's there. It's the space and place dynamics of this book are really fascinating as well. The film stars have bought Gossington Hall because it's handy for those studios, but that means that Gossington Hall, which once stood for rural tradition in the Marple canon and was a real focal point of previous works, is now changed and modernised. And with that comes the interesting dynamic then with Mrs. Bantry, who used to own Gossington Hall.
Yeah, which I love. I love this so much, this idea that, you know, Mrs. Bantry has got to move to one side, make way for the new sort of top of the totem pole in the village. Yes. But also that she doesn't really mind. This is what I really love about it.
She does take it with good grace, doesn't she?
There's a bit in, I can't remember which adaptation, it might be the BBC one, that I absolutely love, where she's going into her new little lodge because she doesn't live in the big house. And she loves it because she's got, you know, all these little contraptions and things in her kitchen and stuff, and that is actually what she's really happy to do. And yes, this idea that Mrs. Bantry was always the focus of society in St Mary Mead and thereabouts, and now of course it's going to be Marina Gregg. Dolly is almost, well, we hear that she's a bit embarrassed because she sort of goes to the cinema a bit and she has an idea of who Marina is. But when she goes to the cinema, she is going just for the pictures, we're told. It's not for the credits. She's not paying attention. She's not reading these fan magazines or anything.
Yeah.
I think she feels that she should know her better. But even though she doesn't really know much about Marina herself, the very idea that they sort of could be friends, or at least on really good friendly terms, she loves. You know, she's not doing this snobbish thing which we might expect, certainly from other characters and probably in different periods of Christie's writing, who might be quite snobbish about the idea of film stars. Here it's terribly exciting. We're told that there is no denying that Mrs. Bantry was flattered by all of the attention that she gets from Marina Gregg, because Marina's always offering her to come up for tea and to look and see what they've done to the house, and because I think she feels, don't worry, we're going to treat it well, and Dolly's like, oh, don't worry, it's fine, I'm gone, it's yours.
How many toilets they've put in.
Always about the toilets.
Because famously, is that Christie...
It's got to be, hasn't it, about Greenway.
Yeah, so the American GIs that stayed in the repurposed Greenway House, Christie's holiday home in the Second World War, installed
14, I think, toilets downstairs. I think it's along that bit when we went to Greenway, like opposite the kitchen. I think it was
that
along
corridor.
That bit.
Yeah.
So,
and she has them take almost all of them out.
Well, the problem is that when they left, they were like, and we've given you extra toilets.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't want 14 toilets. And so there was a bit of a hoo-ha about who was going to pay to remove all of these toilets. And yes, so Dolly is flattered because a celebrated film star is a celebrated film star, and elderly ladies, though they may be of local importance, are aware of their complete unimportance in the world of celebrities. So it's almost like Marina's coming in and saying, no, don't worry, I think you're important. It's not just St Mary Mead. So I think we also see a real rise of Agatha Christie as a celebrity in this era, don't we? She obviously has been, you know, ever since, I guess, her disappearance in the 20s, she's been a bit of newspaper fodder. But now the idea of celebrity, things like those magazines that Miss Marple was looking at in the Mirror Cracked, they are everywhere. And I think this in the 60s feels particularly significant because we've now got Agatha Christie being a brand as much as she is an author.
in part enabled, I guess, by the fact that Agatha Christie Limited is formed in 55 and then in this decade really kind of finding its feet, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of Agatha Christie Limited, really, is to take some of the personal pressure off Christie in lots of ways, but also to ensure her legacy, to make sure that Agatha Christie keeps going long after, Agatha Christie herself is perhaps capable of writing or able to consistently turn out books. So, we've mentioned things like even Murder Ahoy. Murder Ahoy is an original Miss Marple film starring Margaret Rutherford from 1964, which obviously is a really good example of Agatha Christie as a branding being important. So that isn't an Agatha Christie story being brought to the screen there, but it's using the Agatha Christie name, it's using one of her key creations, Miss Marple, to, spin off in a direction for perhaps a slightly different audience to those who go and buy her books. I'm not saying there isn't a substantial bit of crossover, but you can absolutely watch that film without thinking, now I'm going to go and have to read all the Miss Marple books. They're not necessarily linked.
Yeah. And also you made the point that we've got translations into other languages increasing in this time.
Yeah, I mean, UNESCO makes a whole big song and dance about it. There's several different ways they phrase it, but they basically say at the beginning of the 60s, Agatha Christie is the most successful author internationally. And they talk about sales, they talk about translations in particular. And we were saying earlier on in this episode about how often Christie's used for people being introduced to English as a foreign language.
Yes, yeah.
And as beautiful as her writing is, her sort of plots and characters and lots that goes on in her books are universal, so you can translate them and they've still got resonance for people wherever you're reading them in the world.
Well, the point being that if it's accessible the world over, then she's more likely to become this global brand anyway, which is what happens. Also, we talked in, I think, our sex episode when we covered Lady Chatterley's Lover and how that sort of heralded the start of this paperback boom. Obviously, the idea of grabbing a cheap softcover in a railway bookstall is really one that's taking flight in this decade, and Christie absolutely benefits from that as well, right?
Yeah, because there's Fontana in the UK publishing loads of these paperbacks, often with these Tom Adams covers that are, really striking and make them seem even more mysterious, but like they're quite they're really distinct. Like they don't just look like run-of-the-mill whodunits or adventure stories or whatever.
Yeah, because I think it's probably fair to say that the sorts of people that read Agatha Christie, as we say, as she becomes this legacy figure, are the sorts of people that are very likely to want to pick up, perhaps while travelling, perhaps for ease, a smaller, easier edition. So you can see why she really chimed with that format.
Yes, yeah. And by modern standards, her books weren't very long. They are really easy to, you can read one in an afternoon if you're really determined. This thing about the paperbacks, though, what I think is quite interesting is that there's a slight fork in the road here, because at the same time, her back catalogue is being repurposed slowly for this new set of hardback editions. They're called the Greenway editions, and they start in the late 60s.
With the sort of fish motif.
The three fish
which
motifs
she drew herself.
Yeah, she used to doodle it, apparently. And yes, and I was just reading some of the correspondence about it. But what was really interesting was that, first of all, she said, why would they be called Greenway? I don't write at Greenway, and it's not really my home, which it really wasn't by then, but they stuck with it anyway. But also, it was actually Edmund Cork, her agent, who said to her, I think that you're really deserving of having one of those literary collections, like people who, your Dickens, your Oscar Wilde, all sorts of people who have got like a canon. And he's saying to her, after all this time, actually, I think that you deserve it. And so that was the idea, that there would be a prestigious collection that was for serious readers of fiction, that you could have your sort of almost whole set of Agatha Christie stories. So it took them, they were published over, I think, about 14 years or so. Friend of the podcast, David Morrison, Collecting Christie, has got a brilliant article about them, actually, where he's uncovered some details about it. And some of them are so rare that he was like, I think this one exists. And I wasn't able to find one in the files to say, that one definitely existed because it's on the sales form.
Yeah.
But they sort of petered out slightly by the early 80s. But this really lovely idea.
Yeah. And, we do that today. We have, I work in publishing, and there I can think of several examples of authors who have a collection of works that are packaged in a slightly more, and I'm using the official publishing term here, highfalutin way, and then more accessible might end up in Smith's or the Works style edition as well. It very much is the case that there is a new breed of celebrity in this time. And it's not quite a resource for this podcast, unfortunately, but it's brilliant. There's a book by Greg Jenner, the historian who hosts You're Dead to Me, another great podcast. And he wrote a book called Dead Famous, which is about the history of celebrity. And it really struck me. One of the things he says in his foreword, I think, in that is that he stopped at the 1950s because basically our conception of what a celebrity is today comes from around that time. Oh, right. And so I think we can use that extra, and I agree with that absolutely. So I think we can use that to denote that, yeah, actually in this period we are talking about celebrity in the way that we understand it today. Another contextual point, which is quite interesting, is Muriel Spark, The Public Image, which was published in 1968. It was actually shortlisted in the inaugural Booker Prize in 1969. It's set in Rome, and it's all about this kind of couple of film stars who are both trying to leverage their fame to further their careers in extremely outlandish ways. It's sort of a tragicomedy, as typical of Muriel Spark, but that really engaged with all the iconography of the time. So fame, money, success, people on these platforms being talked about in this way, being presented visually in popular culture, is all very much timely for the period we're looking at.
Passenger to Frankfurt, because everything comes back to Passenger to Frankfurt,
It
right?
does, and rightly so.
It was published as her allegedly 80th book in her 80th year.
Yes,
and
to great fanfare.
To great fanfare. Well, it was an extravaganza. So yeah, there was quite a lot about Christie, like, in the press, because she was turning 80, and it was this book. You know, they were talking about it at least a year in advance, this idea of like, we're going to give a special push to this book.
Yeah. Well, and it worked because, as we discussed, that it sold really well.
But
also,
really
that,
well.
I wonder if, am I right in saying they did that for Murder is Announced a few decades?
Yeah, in 1950, that
Yes.
they publicised that as her 50th book.
Again, massaging the numbers slightly.
Yes.
Is there an argument to say that that was considered a success, so they were trying to repeat the success in 1970?
Yeah, very possibly. There's a few comments to Christie at the time that basically say, we're not going to be able to avoid this. It's going to be so obvious that it's your 80th birthday, and that Collins has sort of worked out it's probably your 80th book. And
Interesting.
That was one of the things that she was sort of forewarned about, and, you know, that there was likelihood that there'd be an expectation of interviews.
Because she didn't like a fuss.
Because she didn't like a fuss. But I love the fact that you go, what are you going to do for your 80th celebration? She gives a Passenger to Frankfurt, which is this bonkers book, you know, in so many ways. Whether you love it or hate it, it is bonkers.
And it is a polemic as well. It's not like a party. It's like, yeah, that is quite fun. And there's something really significant about tying the figure of the author, the popular culture idea of the author, their age, their personal life, so their birthday, and their work all together in a neat bow.
I'm going to go out on a slightly odd tangent here and say that there's something about the way that Christie, you know, is very popular early in her career and consistently stays popular. And then suddenly, when she gets in her 70s and stuff, starts to become iconic, dare I say, this idea that you know, she is bigger than anything else. And this adoration that there is for her, it reminds me of Dolly Parton. Like Dolly Parton going to, you know, being very successful in the late 60s through to the 70s, and then having, you know, some film hits and stuff, and still consistently pottering along. But there's something about Dolly Parton in the last 15 years or so, and I think particularly in the UK, actually.
I thought you were going to say particularly for gay men.
And particularly for gay men in the UK. Actually, this is a man who has gone to see Dolly Parton in concert.
Too many times.
Well, it's fascinating. It's the only time where it was like a 50-50 division between gay men and pensioners. Only concert I've ever been to where the queue for the gents was longer than the queue for the and we had an interval and everything, so everyone could have a little bit of a break. But now she is adored. Like, her music, I won't say is secondary because she just had a #1 album, but like Dolly Parton as a person is so huge now, and yet she's just sort of been trugging along, consistently successful and popular, and then suddenly towards you know, she's in her 70s, this part of her career, people go, wow, what would we do without Dolly Parton? You know? And I feel there's a bit of that about Christie too.
Yeah, oh definitely. And not a bizarre tangent at all, because this is actually a beautiful segue, because one of the things I think that's happened there with Dolly Parton, and one of the things that happens with Christie, I love the way... Did you see those comments we got when we released a few episodes that was like, only you two could like talk about Mariah Carey and Lambs and then Agatha Christie? It's like, here's a new one. Here's Parton and Christie. Yeah. But Dolly Parton was a 60s icon, so it's all relevant. But one of the things that enables figures like that, partly it is because of the name and the legacy and the success and the media and attitudes and new fandoms kind of cropping up and all the rest of it. But partly it is that what they've always been doing goes in and out of fashion, comes back into vogue. And I think, there's a real country's having a real renaissance and has been having a real renaissance in the last 15 years or so, particularly at the moment with Beyonce's album and all the rest of it. And similarly, the sort of thing that Christie is specifically known for writing has, never really gone out of fashion. So Kynaston looks at genre. He's actually looking at TV in particular, but he's looking at genre and popular culture. And there's this BBC research from the mid-60s. So we have people who look for detective story plots at a staggering 56%.
Wow.
Of this is the TV viewing public. But then something that deals with real present day problems, 42%. What's Passenger to Frankfurt? What's Third Girl? What's The Clocks even? Content about ordinary, nice people, 34%. Not everyone in Christie is particularly nice, but many of them are ordinary. And then things like plenty of violent action or content that relies on ideas with little or no story or plot, which I would argue Christie is not those things. No. Those come quite far down the list in terms of appetite. So yeah, I think definitely there's the name, the cachet, the legacy, but also if you can ride the crest of what's still being consumed and enjoyed at the time, which Christie very much does, then that's partly what propels you to this superstardom.
That's interesting because that reminds me that Afternoon at the Seaside.
Afternoon at the Seaside is a one-act play, part of the Rule of Three collected plays, about the theft of an emerald necklace beside the seaside in 1962.
It was shown on television, so it was, broadcast. Unfortunately, it doesn't survive. It was broadcast on the BBC, and it got a bit of a roasting from critics. I said earlier about how reviews of Christie were generally really good, and they were for her books, but actually for her plays, she got a bit of a rougher ride. Less so, Witness for the Prosecution is a bit of an exception there, but generally they were a bit sniffier, theatre critics, about Christie. So Afternoon at the Seaside, which I think was certainly the most lightweight of the Rule of Three
and most dated.
Yeah, I would say so. It's almost a little bit generic, that Christie, whereas the other two are perhaps a bit more exciting. But that's one they chose to show. And the critics weren't keen at all, to put it mildly. But what's interesting is we do have, or I do have somewhere, a copy of the audience research report, which is glowing. So when they actually asked people who watched it, like I remember reading, and there were so many A's that, because you had to give it from an A plus to an F minus or something along those lines. And, people were really enjoying it. And I think it averaged out at B plus or A minus or something.
Oh, wow.
So that's such a good indication that actually critics are a bit out of step with what audiences are really enjoying.
Yeah. It also goes back to the point that we sort of set out with from the very beginning, which is this idea that the 60s weren't swinging for everyone.
Yeah.
And the Sandbrick argument about how, keep trotting this out, but that more people rushed out to buy the Sound of Music soundtrack on vinyl than ever did Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles album. And yeah, it is that proof in the pudding that maybe that's one of the things we've discovered along the way of this project, which is that Christie is so successful in the 60s because she's catering towards both. If you want a hit of nostalgia, there's, elements of, Afternoon at the Seaside, Mirror Cracked. If you want something startlingly modern and new, there's Third Girl, there's Passengers Frankfurt, there's Endless Night. She does both. Get you a girl who does both.
Well, this other thing about Christie as being a woman in her 70s who you might at this point think doesn't have much power because there's Agatha Christie Limited, right? There's the company, there's a board and all sorts. It doesn't stop her from being very forthright in her opinions and her thoughts about things. So she isn't just saying, I'll just rattle off, I'll try to do a book every year and then I'll leave it up to you. She's talking about things like covers. She loved a cover for Third Girl. I don't want to give the impression that she was always negative when giving her opinion. That's one example. She thought it was, handsome, I think she calls it. She also would complain, though, about Colin's typeface, which she said, it's supposed to be easy reading, and I don't find it easy reading at all, or something along those lines.
Interesting.
Christie can be quite charming about the fact that she understands that she can sometimes perhaps come across as being difficult, when of course it's just her being very keen to make sure that her voice is heard. And I think that if she were a male author, we wouldn't even be questioning it in that way. But maybe she feels that there is a sense that other people are perceiving her as difficult because she's saying, I don't like my book being packaged in this way or being sold in this way, which she often had to do in the 60s, unfortunately. But we get this relayed through Poirot and sort of other characters. Mrs. Restorick in Third Girl mentions that elderly people can be very difficult sometimes, and Poirot says, I know, frequently I too am difficult.
So it's nice. It's like Poirot's got Agatha's back.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, I think there is a self-awareness in that. It's almost a nod and a wink to Cork reading it, or Dorothy Olding, or her US agent, or someone like that. It's funny. I was reviewing her autobiography recently for Top Secret Project. But one of the things I noticed in that is that I think a lot of this expressing a clear opinion about the way in which her books are published, it comes from the fact that she's sort of taken the mickey out of initially, that she was naive to what they were actually expecting, and that she was sort of taken for a ride a little bit. And one of the reasons why she moves publisher is to kind of course correct that. And I think she never quite lets go of that feeling that, well, by this point, I've published X number of books. I know what I'm doing. I know who my audience are. Like, listen to my opinion. And it's, as you say, it's very easy to just dismiss that as cantankerousness.
Part of being a celebrity is also having fans.
As we know.
Shut up. So once you're a celebrity, a big part of that means that you're going to have fans, and Christie, of course, is no exception, getting lots of fan mail.
I think what's interesting about the relationship between celebrities as they're becoming in this period and fans is very different to today, in the sense that now we have social media, there are DMs. Back then it would be a case of receiving a letter and replying to it. The celebrity is a new definition. Similarly, the fan is a new type of relationship, but it's also moved on a lot now.
So during this decade, Christie is receiving huge volumes of fan mail because she is so well known. She is somebody that people want to write to, very often in complimentary terms, sometimes to pick holes in her stories, sometimes to say, oh, I really like this one. It was much better than that one, which is the sort of barbed compliments that people, I think, were writing without really thinking about it. But sometimes she'd reply and say, oh, yes, I agree. Or actually, that was one of my favourites. But in general, the volume was much, much higher than any individual could reply to. So it was only the occasional thing that she wrote back to. It's fairly random when you look through it, because there's like someone asking about whether they could put Poirot and Marple on stamps, and she writes a really grumpy reply to this. You think, why that one? But it clearly just sort of caught her on a day where she thought, no, I'm not having a Poirot and Marple stamp.
Yeah, maybe she's just got an aversion to stamps.
Fair enough. But actually, towards the end of the decade, there's actually really strict instruction from her British agent to her American publishers to say, stop sending the fan mail to Agatha Christie. She's sort of being stressed out by it. Right. So that stops.
And she has celebrity fans.
She does have celebrity fans, yes. So we're saying about paperback readers not necessarily being the same as hardback readers, but John Betjeman, who was the poet laureate, he only ever read poetry in Agatha Christie, according to an interview in 1972, and he always waited for the paperback. And also something that I've put in Marple, because, and I haven't seen referenced anywhere else, is that there is just a day-to-day letter from Christie's American agent to her British agent, where right at the end of it, she says as a little PS, I'm sure I've told you that Jerry Salinger is a great fan of hers and would love her to know this. So J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, famously by that point reclusive, wasn't going to be writing a lot more stuff. J.D. Salinger, he was getting his Agatha Christie's in.
Wow.
I mean, if that is not a real linking between the sort of higher echelons of the literary establishment and Agatha Christie, that's it, isn't it?
Which is an endorsement, which is brilliant to hear, yeah. And we should say, so that's in your forthcoming Marple book, and many other little exclusive tidbits that we'll have never heard before, so that's really exciting. There's one fan correspondence that I wanted to pick out, because Kemper, All About Agatha, did a fantastic episode about this in the last year or so, Agatha Christie in the Flesh, which was all about Christie's correspondence with the Japanese superfan Yasuo Suto, who started corresponding with Christie in 1966 and ultimately met her in 1972.
And thank goodness, because the letters he wrote to her were really good. Like, for a researcher like me, he was asking really good questions about, is Miss Marple based on this? And blah. So I've used, because the replies to him exist still in the various archives. And so I've actually leaned on that quite heavily for some bits of the Marple book as well as the Poirot book, because there's some really nice responses from Christie, because he's a scholar as well as a fan. So he was wanting insight into Christie, rather than just saying, I love your work.
Yeah, a fascinating man. And also very, as Kemper would say, astute reader as well of Christie. Yeah. The other thing that changes about fans and their relationship to celebrities, or increases, enhances, improves, is that visual culture is all the time developing, in the sense that the quality of photographs, more likely to be film footage. So people, not for the first time, but increasingly know what their favourite authors, for example, look like. And you picked out a lovely little...
Yes, so an interview from autumn 1965, Christie says, quite sadly, I'm afraid the fans are sometimes disappointed in my photographs. They write, I had no idea you were so old.
Aww.
But this is, well, it is sad, because it's such a recurring theme with Christie that she hates photographs of herself.
Yeah.
She says about some photos that were taken in the 50s, oh, I like these because they've taken out the wrinkles, but generally didn't like to be photographed. There are some lovely photographs in the 60s for the Observer magazine. It's that quite famous picture of her with her hands crossed, like across her chest.
I don't know if I know that.
Yeah,
we'll find it and post it.
Yeah, well, it's the one I just posted recently that I spotted on the shelf in Murder, She Wrote. There's a little picture of a fictional author. They photoshopped her on, like, as if she'd met Agatha Christie.
Oh, very
And that
clever.
was from that photo shoot, so it's not quite the one that was used in the magazine.
Right.
But yeah, so there are some really nice ones, but she was utterly indignant whenever, especially American publishers, often tried to put photographs of her on the back covers or in the flyleaf and stuff.
Yeah.
And she did not want photographs of her in the book. So you say, oh, I had no idea you were so old, but that's probably because she's still writing very contemporary fiction in lots of ways. And why would you know that she was that old if you're not putting photographs of yourself on the book?
Yeah, maybe that's a backhanded compliment
Well,
in
I
a
think
way.
it is,
Maybe it's...
You don't write like someone in your 70s.
Exactly, it proves what we've been saying about the likes of Third Girl, yeah. It does make me sad, though, when we read stuff like this. I sort of wish she was still around so we could be like, Agatha, you're beautiful, we're doing this podcast and we're praising you to the hilt in all these ways. So another aspect is Christie being dismissive of publicity and the press generally.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because she's often doing stuff because she has to.
Yeah.
And she doesn't understand that. There's this story. So we heard Christie giving a speech at the 10th anniversary of The Mousetrap at the beginning of this episode. Let's go back a few hours before that. Christie recalls how Peter Saunders, the producer, had asked me to get to the Savoy about half an hour before the scheduled time. This, I found when I got there, was for an ordeal of photography. A good thing to get it over, perhaps, but something I had not quite realised was going to happen on such a large scale. I did as I was told, and arrived bravely alone at the Savoy. But when I tried to enter the private room reserved for the party, I was turned back. No admission yet, madam. Another 20 minutes before anyone is allowed to go in. I retreated. Why I couldn't say outright, I am Mrs. Christie, and I have been told to go in, I don't know. It was because of my miserable, horrible, inevitable shyness.
Oh,
so sad.
Yeah. But people often cite that anecdote, don't they, as a lovely reminder of, yeah, she could quite easily be, in modern terms, a diva about stuff like that, but she still stays humbled and awkward about her own stardom.
That so many things seem to have happened that night, because there was her then giving a speech. There's lots of lovely photos, and it's funny that's the night that they surprised Richard Attenborough for This Is Your Life. I showed a clip from it.
Yes,
at the festival a couple of years ago.
But you can see Christie and
she even has a few words. Because Eamon Andrews, the presenter, comes up to her and says, "I can't take Richard Attenborough away without having a quick word with you, Mrs. Christie." And ask for permission, and she says, "Oh, any plaudits for him are well deserved," and off you go.
Yeah.
So it's really lovely, but it's weird that she doesn't mention that in their autobiography. Like, I feel that would be something you might remember. And I've read interviews with people who were there and stuff, and nobody seems to mention, "Oh yes, and Eamon Andrews arrived and took Richard Attenborough off to do This Is Your Life."
He might walk in at any moment for you.
But this thing about interviews, so ones that she felt obliged to do, so things like the 10th anniversary event and some interviews linked with the passenger to Frankfurt who's seeing the big 80th extravaganza. There's this fairly short interview that she does with the Herald Express, which was her local newspaper in Devon. Still going, actually, I think it must be the same newspaper. It's still going in South Devon. But she actually says right at the beginning, I've only said yes because you're a local newspaper. So there's this immediate sort of setting out of, you're lucky, really, because I wouldn't normally say yes, but for you, I'm making an exception. She's asked why she keeps out of the limelight and says that I have a very strong feeling it is not part of an author's life. If you act, or if you are an MP or a public-spirited woman who sits on committees, then you are a part of it. I've only spoken once, and that was at a celebration for the Mousetrap.
And this slight scepticism of publicity does pervade into the novels, doesn't it? There's quite a few references to sort of journalistic characters that are maybe a bit shady or just a general scepticism. And particularly, we pulled out a reference in The Clocks. The Clocks is a Poirot novel about espionage and an unidentified body from 1963. After the murder has occurred, the reporters are sort of buzzing all over the Crescent, and there is a sense that they're not welcome and almost encroaching on Christie's immaculate plot, actually, in that regard.
She's also quite dismissive in a way of people trying to analyze or discuss her work too much. I know. And it's funny because there are a couple of quotes about it, and one where she's more dismissive and another where she goes, well, I'm not very keen on talking about my life. They sort of want to talk about the books, and that's up to them.
I think as well, that reminds me to say again that I think sometimes people take Christie at her word a little bit too much, and then she'll say something that completely contradicts it. And, dare I remind us all that we are all a mass of contradictions, and we contain multitudes, and we can feel one thing one day and another thing the other day. And it's clear that her, as it would be, as for anyone, it would be her attitude towards her own success is complicated.
Yeah. Well, she does say, I think people should be interested in books and not their authors in 1964.
I should say as well, I used to work on a programme where we interviewed authors as our bread and butter. And like I say, I now work in publishing. And I think it's fair to say that in many ways, writers, and I'm including myself in this, are the least reliable contact in terms of talking about their own work and their own standing and who they are and what they represent, because you can't fully see that, you can't fully understand that yourself in many ways.
Didn't I say in our very first episode that the story I tell about how I got into Agatha Christie, I'm not even sure if it's true?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
That whole thing about that, because we're both from South Devon, that I've always felt that must be a link. But the more I think about it, I think, I don't even know when I knew she was from South Devon, but maybe something.
So you're a liar?
No, I'm just a very gifted storyteller.
And your debut novel is out next year.
Oh my God. You always say you're going to write fiction. I'm like, no, I just...
I can't wait for your debut novel. I'm very excited by it.
Yeah, I know, it's really good.
It's in a drawer right now,
It's so good
it?
that I'm scared to publish it. I'm worried that the whole...
That it would end all novels.
Yeah, the whole sort of ecosystem of publishing would crumble because whatever publisher picked it up would just be so dominant.
Watch as you get an email after this now. Genuinely.
Can you ghostwrite it for me?
As she often does, Christie refracts these ideas through her figure of Ariadne Oliver. So in Halloween Party...
Halloween Party is a Poirot mystery novel in which a girl is drowned while apple bobbing from 1969.
We're told that Mrs. Oliver is a bestseller. People wish to interview her to know what she thinks about such subjects as student unrest, socialism, girls' clothing, should sex be permissive, and many other things that are no concern of hers. Yes, said Poirot. Deplorable, I think. They do not learn very much, I have noticed, from Mrs. Oliver. They learn only that she is fond of apples. That has now been known for 20 years at least, I should think, but she still repeats it with a pleasant smile.
Yeah, that's Agatha Christie.
But
who ate apples in the bath and
It's true that authors, I think often public figures, even to this day, they are expected to trot out opinions about things that really isn't what they're known for or anything to do with their work. But it's interesting to hear that feeling, if not originates from the 60s, then is present in the 60s. We know, and big fans of Christie's will know, that she wrote a series of novels under a pseudonym, Mary Westmacott, which was initially a secret, and then her identity is exposed in the 50s.
Yeah.
Not long before she actually finishes writing them.
Yeah, I think the 5th and the 6th are the ones that came out.
Yes.
When people knew who Mary Westmacott was, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I can't help but feel like, it's quite common to hear people say things like The Hollow or Endless Night could be a Mary Westmacott if it weren't for the fact that there were a murder in it, and that's what kind of tips it into Agatha Christie. And I wonder if there is something so experimental about her 60s books, as we keep saying, that means that she maybe doesn't need the option of putting them out under that name. And also, as we're saying, fame. Maybe we know from her autobiography that her publishers were understandably not keen on her putting books out without the selling point, which is her name. So yeah, maybe she's kind of reached the point where she can relax the definition of what is an actual Agatha Christie. And, I'm actually reading my way through the Westmacotts at the moment, and it struck me when reading Giant's Bread, which is essentially about a couple getting married and the question being who has the wealth, who has the house. That is essentially Endless Night. That's something that she's been writing about since forever. So the last Mary Westmacott novel, The Burden, is published in the UK in 1956. Although I should say, when I was sort of digging a little deeper, it is true to say that both A Daughter's a Daughter and The Burden, so the last two Mary Westmacotts, were actually first published in the US in the 60s. They were both published in 1963. And given so much of this project has been about, what did people in the 60s receive, think, what was their immediate thought on reading that word, reference, whatever it may be. Actually, for US Christie fans, which is a huge swathe of her audience, to all intents and purposes, Mary Westmacott did stray into the 60s. Little interview scourer that you are, you found an interview in the early 60s where Christie speaks about the Westmacotts, right?
Yeah, this is with Julian Simmons, and she was asked by him why she wrote the Westmacotts, and she said, entirely emotional, I suppose. It gives me enormous enjoyment to write them. And she was then asked if she would write any more, and she said, I don't know. I don't want to so much now. I suppose it gives you some outlet that you don't get elsewhere. But I think it is terribly boring, really, to have to write the same thing all your life. I would like to have written all sorts of different books, tried all kinds of different things. Which I obviously am very sympathetic to, but as we've said, actually there are quite a lot of genres and story types in Christie regardless. So maybe it's the expectation.
Yeah, I like to think it's almost as if she's then progressing through the 60s, working out that she can, as we say, redefine maybe what a book with Agatha Christie's name on it can be without it needing to be siphoned off into something separate. Because, as we've established, she doesn't write the same thing all her life, and she doesn't write the same thing through the 60s at all. It's not published until 1977, but Agatha Christie starts writing her autobiography in the mid-50s and finishes it in the mid-60s, right?
Yeah, or even earlier. We think that she started sketching it out around 1950 and certainly had finished it by 1965. She spent a long time working towards it, and a lot of it was dictated, and I did at one point manage to look at a draft version that you can see that she obviously was writing it over quite a long period of time because there's a lot of repetition. That's what, 90% of the work was to get it into a publishable state, was that, she would tell the story again because she might have last told that story when she was writing the book 10 years earlier.
Well, and indeed, sometimes she tells those stories in her novels, but very thinly veiled, doesn't she? And there are passages, for example, there's one in the Second World War about being bombed out of Sheffield Terrace, and passages, I'm obsessed with Passengers to Frankfurt, everyone. Passages of Taken at the Flood, her Second World War novel, that you can put side by side, and the wording is almost exactly the same. And there are several examples of that.
Bertram's Hotel's a really good one, isn't it?
Yeah. At Bertram's Hotel is a Miss Marple novel set in a London hotel, which is not quite what it seems, from 1965. Army and Navy stores.
Yeah, and the whole thing about that they would get a four-wheeler to the theatre or something and go to the Army and Navy.
Oh, yes.
It's the same story.
And also, I've just finished reading Unfinished Portrait, and so so much of Unfinished Portrait is repeated in the autobiography in terms of, like the gunman and her experiences with Archie.
I've just given you a copy of Max Mallowan's memoirs, her second husband, and he talks quite a bit about Unfinished Portrait in that and says that's the closest insights to what Agatha was like. Bear in mind that the autobiography hadn't come out at the point that Max was writing that. So,
yes, yeah. That quote is in fact on my copy of the Westmacott, on my copy of
is it?
Portrait. Max
nice.
Saying that it's the closest portrait of her, yeah. It's perhaps not surprising that there's quite a lot of overlap in sections with Bertram's Hotel, because she must have finished writing the autobiography around the time that Bertram's was coming out.
Yeah, so lots of, which is such a, I don't know, backwards looking, but nostalgic type book. It's very much about the past, Bertram's Hotel, the links between the past and the present. And so yeah, that's really fitting, isn't it? I know that she said that one of the reasons why she wrote her autobiography, because she's such a private person that you might think, why would she write it? That she said to Wyndham in the mid-60s, if anybody writes about my life in the future, I'd rather they got the facts right. So it's sort of her version of events, and actually it's so focused on her early life.
Yeah. I made the point in my Muriel Spark, Agatha Christie comparison that I quoted that, and I made the point that could have easily been a quote from Muriel Spark, because she says almost exactly the same thing about writing her autobiography, Curriculum Vitae, which is much more facts and figures. But again, that idea of she's been burned by other people narrativizing her life and wants to set the record straight. It's unavoidable when talking about Christie's 60s works, the fact that this is the penultimate decade in which she is writing. And I talked about this right at the beginning of this project about Edward Said's concept of late style. And I think I'd just like to bring us back to it as we're coming to the end of this first run of episodes on the Swinging Christies, because Said's actually predominantly talking about classical music, but his scholarship is frankly so brilliant, it's kind of been extrapolated out and applied to all sorts of artistic forms. And I think it's actually really fruitful to think about Christie in these terms. But I'd just like to make the point again, bring us back to Said, because there are elements of Christie's 60s writings a bit rough around the edges, or a bit atypical, or, as we say, experimental. Bits of her character, as we hear, that are difficult or, changing. And I think part of this project's ethos has been about embracing those aspects rather than using it as a reason to reject the later works. If Christie were thought of as literary, which I think is fair to say we both think she should be, if indeed you believe that being literary actually means anything, then to have a late style, to have a development into a slightly different mode of writing would be desirable. So Said argues in On Late Style that a creative's work transforms later in life, and that has as much to tell us about the figure and the culture of the time as any of their heyday stuff that maybe gets more attention. And I'm taking some of this from Edward Rothstein's review of On Late Style, which was in the New York Times. But he says, a late style would reflect a life of learning, the wisdom that comes from experience, the sadness that comes from wisdom, and a mastery of craft that has nothing left to prove. It might recapitulate a life's themes, reflect on questions answered, and allude to others beyond understanding. I mean, if we've not seen in the last 9 episodes that that's Christie's 60s work, then I don't know what is. We want to feel that in a final confrontation with mortality, something profound takes place. When the end is near, we want there to be a sign of this in the work itself, some proof of accumulated insight. I mean, again, I point you to the word experimentation, endless night, the rule of 3, aspects of Third Girl, tick, tick, tick in terms of previous episodes. But in exploring late style, quoting again, Said isn't really interested in lateness that brings harmony and serenity, because Said argues, Said, who was famous for his writing on Orientalism and the sort of legacy of colonialism, he is essentially arguing that continuity, harmony and serenity, they're actually imperialistic impositions. And again, our Empire episode, what did we find in that exploration is actually, for the most part, a surprising embracing of the world and its changing ways from Christie. there's this perception of unresolved contradiction. See also the fact that Passenger to Frankfurt, as we've said, is both incredibly reactionary and incredibly progressive, sometimes within the same sentence, sometimes within the same character. Tick again, we found this in our Armageddon episode. And overall, a sense that late work is aware that it's late work, an irony almost, which again, tick, tick, tick. Yeah. This is exactly what we've uncovered. I think it's Janet Morgan who makes the point that Christie is absolutely meticulous in checking all the loose ends of her plots as late as these later novels that we're talking about. And I just want to stake a claim yet again for Christie being literary, Christie being profoundly interesting, even in her imperfections, even in the later works. Late style, Said suggests, expresses a sense of being out of place and time. It is a rejection of what is being offered. And this is where Christie deviates, I think, because as we've discovered through this podcast, actually these 60s books are incredibly timely rather than timeless. And, I'm going to be cheeky and say that's Christie going even one better than what Said is expecting from an author's later style. For the purposes of this project, we've shown that she's absolutely every bit a 1960s author as Richard Yates, as Sylvia Plath, as James Baldwin. The single-mindedness of this author. We must stop robbing women of agency, particularly older women, and particularly older women writers like Christie. And at the risk of sounding like I'm giving a speech at a wake, she still, after the point that we're looking at, has several novels to go, several years left to lead into the 70s, and a lot more to show us.
Yeah, I mean, all the way through the 60s, she's quite often giving a sense that maybe, I'm getting towards the end of my career and perhaps I won't keep writing. But she does keep writing.
Yeah.
She says that, it's as late as 1969. Every time that she writes something, I say, this is the last one I'll ever write. The family say, you always say that. And I say, no, this time I really mean it. But Christie says you get into a habit, and once you're in a mould of doing a thing, and consider you do it reasonably well, shall we say, you want to go on doing it.
More than reasonably well.
Yeah, and also a habit, it's like, if I must churn out another classic,
Yeah.
Oh dear, go on. Endless night. I'll It's so lovely, though, to obviously be fans of Agatha Christie as we are, and to see that when you look at this period in context but also in its own right, the ways that she is appreciated by so many people, not just by mass readership or people going to see Margaret Rutherford movies or whatever, but the establishment as well. A lot of this kicks off in the 1950s, where we have things like she got her CBE in 1956, which she wrote to her agent about and said, I think she was out on a dig, I think. And she said, nobody quite understands what it is, and that people had started to think that she had a damehood. And she was like, no, not quite. it's sort of along those lines. But she was really proud, because she mentions it once or twice later on, to be elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Obviously, things like the Ramsay book, taking her seriously, linking analysis with a bit of biography and the bibliography as well.
We said from the start we were going to look at Agatha Christie 1959 to 1971-ish, which is when the Harlequin tea set is published, which is pretty much the latest we've gone. And
beginning in 1971, we've got the icing on the cake,
which
is in the New Year's Honours list. Agatha Christie is made a dame. She gets a DBE. So this was something she was so proud of. She even adds either dame or DBE to her name in one of her notebooks when she's getting, it's so sweet. She really is so proud of this. Actually, some of the critics had mentioned for years, why isn't she a dame yet?
Yeah.
It is something that is fully well deserved, and quite right too. Dame Agatha Christie, without whom, well, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah. Episode called Fame Made a Dame.
So now we're throwing it out to you, the listener, because we really want to hear what you've got to say about Agatha Christie in the 1960s.
Yeah.
What have we said that you think there's something else to say about? Do you have anything that you think we got wrong, or that we could have a different perspective on? Is there anything that we've really missed or that you wanted to tease a bit more out of? We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to hear what people's favourite Christies from the 1960s are. I'm always interested to hear that. I know a mean, I think I wrote on Twitter the other day that my answer to that question changes almost on a daily basis as we've been going through this project. But it's always interesting to hear the one that you've just started reading that maybe you'd never picked up, or if you're new to Christie, and I know there are quite a few of you listening to this who are, then yeah, when you pick up a 60s Christie, send us a picture, let us know. And as we said, this is not the end of the project. It's not the end of the podcast. It's very much, this was the first run. And now we're going to spin into a slightly different direction with bonus episodes and a few little surprises up our sleeves. The first thing we'll be doing is coming back together for a reflections episode in which, we want to cover off anything, as Mark says, that you think we might have missed and just generally, reflect. And it's aptly named because there's a Supremes.
Diana Ross and the Supremes, one of my favourite songs.
Yeah.
Through the mirror of my mind.
I'm going to leave that in.
Time after time. Yeah,
Beautiful.
That's a threat now. Now no one's going to come back. So now Mark started singing. What was the point of which the Swinging Christies jumped the shark? It's definitely when Mark started singing Diana Ross and the Supremes.
I really liked the Swinging Christies, and then it became a musical podcast. But it is a threat. We will be back.
So you can get in touch with us across social media, X and Insta at Christie_time. You can email us at theswingingchristies@gmail.com. You can also contact us through the website, which is christietime.com. There's loads of other stuff on the website, including a resources tab where we list all of the books and films and TV programmes and such like that we've discussed. And also it's where we put any upcoming events.
Yep.
Please do rate and review us wherever you listen to us. That really is lovely to see. It's very nice. You can find Gray on X at classic_Graham. I'm on both Instagram and X at Dr. Mark Aldridge.
And on our Linktree on our socials, you can find links to Mark's books. So Agatha Christie on Screen, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world. Oh, yes, he is. And you can pre-order now Mark's upcoming book, Agatha Christie's Marple, Expert on Wickedness, which is fantastic. I cannot recommend it highly enough.
Yes, Gray's getting a free copy, I think, for all of the hard work. He's into plugging it at the end of these episodes.
Hey, what, you're not going to sign it?
Well, devalue it. Make sure you can't ever sell it.
Yeah, could you just make it out to no one in particular, just so I can... No, I don't have an eBay account. I don't know what you mean.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Oh, yeah, we never do the bye properly, do we?
No. I was thinking, I literally to the shower, I was like, we should keep swinging. And I was like, it's too late for a catchphrase. It's episode 9.
Keep swinging.
And even then, it's like, oh.
It's
yeah,
gross,
don't.
You know, if you search for our podcast on Apple Podcasts, loads of sexy podcasts come up.
I know.
I mean, thanks to Mitch's artwork, we are also a very sexy podcast to look at, but it's not that kind of podcast.
Yeah.
Famously. Fame. Thanks for listening. I'm not going to make a joke here like I always do. I'm genuinely a heartfelt thank you for listening, because we do really appreciate it and we're having a ball and we're going to keep having a ball. The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 14th of April 2024. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio and our music is by Dar Golan.
It's not from that though. It's from alcohol.
Drunk again, Mark.
Yeah, sorry, I'll put that back. Drunk again.
No, we are.
Oh my God, don't put this in. We've done this too many times. I'm not having another reference to us having had a
It's our last regular episode, not final episode of all time, but last regular episode. So I think it's only fair that we have a cheers.
Cheers.